All right, since we're not talking about terrorism, team, I'm not an expert at it by trade, but we got somebody who is when it comes to health and what to do about this response. We are joined now by Dr. Scott Atlas of the Hoover Institution. He was former chief of neuroradiology at Stanford University Medical School. He also wrote a piece for The Hill. The data is in. Stop the panic and end the total isolation, that has been read millions of times already since its publication a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Scott Atlas, thanks so much for joining.
Sure, thanks for having me.
All right, let's just start. I mean, I have a lot of things I want to ask you. We really appreciate you giving us some of your time today. But let's start with the fight over reopening, which has really turned into a fight over testing. Yesterday, the president had a press conference in which you had a lot of journalists becoming very testy with him over this issue, pardon the phrase. And the suggestion is always that we're not testing enough. And if we only tested more, we would finally be out of the woods with this thing. What's the truth of test and trace as you see it, as a policy?
Sure. Okay, so testing has an important role in what to do next. And we didn't talk about what could have been done, what should have been done. That's not relevant. It's only what to do now. And the role of testing is actually strategically important for three groups of people. Number one, anyone who walks into or works in a nursing home, because those are the most vulnerable people. In fact, I've said it before, every third-year medical student in the country knew those were the most vulnerable people, because older people with underlying chronic diseases like diabetes, renal failure, heart failure, and immunocompromised people. Those are the high-risk people, and these, by the data, have been the high-risk people. Roughly 30% of people who have died in the U.S. are in nursing homes. By the way, you have to remember before I go on, these are people living in a restricted entry situation already. It's not that difficult to actually understand. Once you know they're vulnerable, which we did from day one, the lockdown should have been on that group. Instead, we have more than 5,000 deaths in New York. We have thousands of people, maybe 20,000, probably more, died in nursing homes. Some states, many states, more than 50% of people who have died are nursing home people. People who are we can't just walk into a nursing home to begin with. This should have been day one. But, we have to understand that once we know that the risk of death for everybody overall is tenfold less than what was originally said, we're talking about 99% of people have either no symptoms or mild disease. And so when we see that, and we know by now, I'm getting to your answer, that millions of people have the infection. Okay, that's just factually true. It's documented by the seropositive antibody testing, and it has been verified in many, many places. So we know that the people that should be tested then, one, nursing home entrants, two, doctors and first responders, because they're dealing with patients who have diseases. We can't have them spreading to vulnerable people. Three, patients with respiratory symptoms or symptoms of an upper respiratory infection, fever, who come into a medical center. Those three people need testing. But the idea of contact tracing, although it's important for future pandemics, although it's important if we get another dose of this pandemic, fall, winter, spring, that's important. But right now, the role of contact tracing is to prevent a pandemic from taking hold. Once a pandemic is in place, which this is, you neither should prioritize contact tracing nor even can. It's literally ludicrous. I hate to speak with hyperbole, but when I get going on this, it's hard to stop, because millions of people have the disease. What are you going to do? Test somebody, and then there's 10 million people in the U.S. who have the infection. A guy gets on the subway in New York. He's been on 2 subways. How are you going to trace that? We know people are infected. There's a ton of people infected already. They've already contacted people. And back to my point of 99% of people have mild or no symptoms, 50% are asymptomatic. You can't contact trace when millions of people already have the infection. It is not a predicate for reopening. It's something for later on down the line, once we're past this pandemic, and then we're anticipating the potential, not the certainty of a second wave, but the potential of a second wave.
So with the reopening, and we're speaking to Dr. Scott Atlas, who was the former chief of neuroradiology at Stanford University Medical Center. He's at the Hoover Institution now. With the status of the reopening right now, we keep getting told, wait 2 more weeks, or, oh, wait for the second wave. Doc, how worried are you about states like Georgia and Texas and others that have done this phased reopening? What do you see happening right now, and what is it that the more catastrophist-minded experts and policymakers are missing here?
We're witnessing really the absence of logic in public policy, okay? We know a lot about this disease. We're not starting from day one anymore. The fear and panic that, honestly, everyone was afraid. I was personally afraid when I first saw these death rates and, oh my God, new infection. We know what's happening now. We instituted a policy to do something. The policy was to flatten the curves. What curves? Not the curve of cases, because the more you test, the more cases there are. And so we were talking, everyone was talking about flattening the curves for hospitalizations per day and deaths per day, with the goal being really only one goal. The goal was always one thing and one thing only: stop the overcrowding of hospitals so that we didn't get a bunch of deaths from other people and an overwhelming of the system. And so the deaths per day, really, to stop the deaths, you have to protect the people who are going to die. I mean, this is not that complicated, and we know how to do that. What we've learned is that there's a much lower fatality rate than originally thought that induced this fear and this isolation, total shutdown. We know who to protect, and we know that we can get people who are mildly ill. We can assume they have the infection, younger, healthier people who don't need medical care, because 98, 99% of people who get the infection do not need significant medical care. They have these sort of flu, upper respiratory infections, or they're entirely asymptomatic. If they're sick, they should self-isolate at home. And then we smartly and strategically use the 3 testing type groups that I mentioned, and then we open the low-risk groups. What are the low-risk groups? We open K through 12 schools. There is zero scientific evidence to think you should keep K through 12 schools closed. Very, very rare to get a serious illness in that age group. Almost unheard of to die in that age group. We hear a lot of sensationalist stories now coming out in the news, even last night, about children getting these rare diseases from possibly associated with COVID-19. That does not change the overwhelming amount of evidence we have. In fact, every infection known to man has exceptions where a group of people who are not typically vulnerable have severe, if not lethal, complications. This is true in the flu. In my own career, I've seen many, many cases of brain inflammation, overwhelming inflammation in children from post-flu disease. Influenza. 100 people a year in the U.S. die of chickenpox. The exceptions do not disprove the rule. This is what I mean by lack of logic. And so we should be opening schools. We should be protecting highly vulnerable people, like even high-risk teachers. Although, by the way, the median age of a teacher in K through 12 is 41. It's not 65. So when you look at who should be protected, we know who to protect. We know that children are not at risk for being sick or get hospitalized or die. They should be going to school. We know that most offices and restaurants and public businesses can be open. How? With smart new guidelines on hygiene, sanitization standards, warnings about elderly customers and at-risk people, educating the public. We know how to socially distance now. That was never even a word in our vocabulary. We know how to protect these people, but there's zero reason to institute lockdown. There's no science behind that. That's simply when fear has really impacted public policy.
Well, Dr. Atlas, I just want to jump, because this is really important, because whenever someone who's not of your background and expertise even questions whether the lockdown was sound policy. They are shouted down, screamed at, and people will say horrible things. Do you think, because you have the background, so people can't dismiss you and then just say, nasty things about how you're not an expert. Do you think the lockdown policy was worth it based on the data we have now?
I'll correct you and say that they can say nasty things.
Well, no, that's true, right? But they can't really dismiss you. But go ahead, yeah.
So, the answer is, if I were doing it and what I said from the beginning, and many others said, the best strategy would have been a targeted, sensible, knowledge-based strategy of who to protect. Now, that doesn't say that I don't want to say it wasn't wrong to do total lockdown, because something had to be done. It could have been justified. There was a 3 to 4% fatality rate in a disease that no one really thought anyone had immunity to. I don't want to criticize that, but what is wrong is the extension of the lockdown, because we do know what we're doing now. We do have mobilization of resources. We do see flattened curves. If you have a state or a region or a city with a flattened curve without a massive amount of, there was no overwhelming. Outside of the New York tri-state area had 50 to 60% of all the deaths. Okay, I mean Manhattan had an overwhelmed system, and that's a different situation, but that's not California. Okay, and that's not Iowa. That's not Michigan. That's nowhere else. Even though Michigan got hit pretty hard, that's not New York City. So the extension of the lockdown, it's not just that it wasn't logical or that it isn't logical, that it's actually not obeying the science. It's also totally ignoring what rational people do in policy and in life. And that is the harms of the policy itself. There is an obsession now that is developed based on fear and honestly ignorance, that somehow we must stop COVID-19 infections at all costs. Okay, this is completely irrational. I don't think Americans have a hard time understanding this. When they understand what we know and the evidence, and we have a smart way to reopen. Nobody's saying let's have a new Woodstock festival here. What we're saying is let's smartly and strategically open in a way that not only protects people, but allays their fears. Because I could swing open the doors tomorrow and most people aren't going to come because they're afraid. But there has been this COVID-19 at all costs mentality, which actually is the only incentive that somebody like on the, basic scientists, even Dr. Fauci. Okay, I'm not going to criticize Dr. Fauci. The guy's a brilliant scientist with an incredible career and as a public servant and in everything else he's done. His incentive is to stop COVID-19 at all costs. These are not the way policies are designed. If we were going to stop COVID-19 at all costs, we're ignoring the harms. What are the harms? 150,000 people a month in the United States have new cancer. They're not getting diagnosed. Half of people on chemotherapy with cancer are not going for their chemo. 2/3 to 3/4 of people getting cancer screening. Okay, women are not getting their pap smears, 70% of them roughly. 2/3 of children in California are not getting their childhood vaccinations. Why? Because of the fear instilled into the American public by fear-mongering, really, unfortunately, although well-intended, politicians with their statements about these projections, et cetera, that are alarming and sensationalized by the media. But the reality is we are killing people with the policy. Now, this is very important. We don't shut down the world from November to March every year because of deaths from influenza. Why not? I mean, if people want to shut down because of these deaths, there are more than 500,000 deaths per flu season every year, even with a vaccine and antiviral drugs, 500,000 plus deaths from influenza every winter.
Globally.
Why aren't we shutting down everything? We have 50,000 Americans die every season from the flu. Why don't we shut down from November to March?
Yeah, if you even ask this question,
irrational.
Yeah, they don't have an answer for this. And if you ask the question, you get into trouble. I see this, and we're speaking to Dr. Scott Atlas of the Hoover Institution, former chief of neuroradiology at Stanford University Medical School. I've only got a couple of minutes, Doc. I wanted to ask you, though, we keep hearing that it's not safe to reopen until we get to some number of tests. I mean, the tracing thing, I'm not a doctor, but I've already figured out that this, for exactly what you said, this is absurd. I mean, you have 300,000 new infections, they think, a day right now based on the 3,000 new cases a day. This is what Dr. Scott Gottlieb of the FDA said a week ago. We don't even have enough tracers to find 10,000 cases in New York City. It's crazy. But on the testing alone side of it, put aside the trace part, they keep saying we have to get to 2 million a day. We have testing centers that are closing. So what do we do about it? Because no one's taking the tests.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of confusion, and really this is sort of a problem of people who can do a Google search and think they're an expert, as well as sort of partial information. There are people who are epidemiologists and statisticians who want testing, but they don't understand and not taking into account the harm of the delays of opening. Again, there has to be an application of logic. We have knowledge. By the way, 99% of people have minimal disease or asymptomatic disease. This sort of infection is not the lethal infection that people are frantic about that creates total confinement. And in fact, it's a way to develop population-based immunity. This is how viruses are eradicated. We have people who get antibodies. They block these networks of infection toward the vulnerable. I mean, this is a basic fundamental fact of immunology and medical science. We've known this for decades. People say, oh, we don't know everything about the virus. Of course we don't know everything about the virus. But we do know that for decades, coronavirus family viruses have 1 to 2 years of resistance once you have antibodies. We do believe in antibodies. That's the whole reason why scientists are excited about transfusing antibodies for a cure or a protection. Antibodies from people who have already had the disease. We do believe in if you don't believe in antibodies, you cannot believe in vaccines at all. Why were you waiting for a vaccine if you don't think that the antibodies are going to confer resistance? Vaccines are injecting something that makes someone create antibodies.
Right.
If you don't believe that's protective, what kind of rational thought would be that you believe in vaccines?
Well, we appreciate your rationality here and expertise, Doc. Dr. Scott Atlas of the Hoover Institution, really appreciate your time, sir. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll come back again.
Okay, thank you.
Joe Biden's still running for president, everybody. You remember that? No one even talks about it right now. The best thing they can do for Biden, and they've even come out and said this, which is pretty amazing. The best thing they can do for Joe Biden is make sure no one really sees him or hears from him. But occasionally he has to appear in public and answer questions and pretend like he's, really a candidate other than just a figurehead, that he's going to convince people to vote for him when really it's just up to the media and the left-wing apparatus to make sure that they'll vote for not Trump, whatever not Trump is. They should just put not Trump on the ballot. The ballots that they're going to make sure are mailed in so they can cheat without getting caught, those ballots. But here is Biden in a rare interview with George Stephanopoulos, also known as Democrat operative from the Clinton administration. But now he's a journalist, folks. We're supposed to believe that this guy doesn't have ideology or opinion. He's just a journo, man, just doing the job. Nobody really believes that, but I guess some people maybe do. Here is Biden on what he would. I love this. Is my favorite. This is what I would. This is what I would do if I were president right now in the year 1957. This is what I would do. Play 11.
If you were president right now, what would you be telling governors to do? I would tell the governors to listen to Dr. Fauci, listen to the scientists, listen to what the facts are. Look, this president has to focus on what's going on here. We're in a situation where there's a great crisis. Dr. Fauci talks about if we open needlessly or open soon, there's going to be needless deaths. And we have to have things in place. Everybody wants to open, George. The governors want to open, but they want to open in a rational way. The president hasn't done his work. The president hasn't done what he's supposed to do. He hadn't provided the materials. He hadn't provided the. I mean, this is ridiculous the way he's talking about.
You heard the president yesterday.
He said politics. This is life.
Yeah, the president hasn't done the thing where he would, in the place, we the people, the thing, the stuff that we need for the virus or something. Just blather, just malarkey, a malarkey spewing loon. That's what this guy has turned into, or that's maybe what he's been for a long time. We have more gear, more ventilators, more masks than we're going to need for years, okay? As I said, they're going to be taking ventilators and making them into snow cone makers in a few years, because what are we going to do with hundreds of thousands of extra ventilators? These are $30,000, $40,000 pieces of equipment. We were told if we didn't have them, everybody was going to die and it was all going to be horrible. And guess what? We got way too many ventilators now. We've now become an exporter of these things, and we're not making money on it. We're just going to give them to other countries. So Biden is just saying stuff that this is the talking point when you got nothing else to say. If I were in charge of the stuff and the thing, and I would, it's just all. What does this even mean? And then he's asked a very specific question about whether the DOJ was right to drop charges against General Michael Flynn, which now, if someone does not agree with this, if they don't understand why the charges against Flynn were dropped, then they're just crazy, right? Then they've just lost all rational thought processes, at least about this issue. And here's Biden's response, which is the non-response. Interestingly enough, I think it's because he realizes he couldn't really, if he got pushed on this issue, he would look bad and he would upset all the left-wingers who still believe that General Flynn is a traitor for Russia like idiots. Here's Biden, play 12.
Was the Justice Department right to drop those charges against Michael Flynn?
Well, based on a couple thousand, I guess I saw a headline yesterday, a couple thousand former, or was it a couple hundred, I'm not sure, a whole lot of former Justice Department people said the Attorney General should step down. I have been absolutely stunned by the way in which he has not conducted the office properly. But look, I don't know the detail of where we are right now. My point is a simple one. Focus on what's in front of us. You have plenty of time to investigate this issue. I think there's nothing there.
That's a great way. That's leadership, isn't it, folks? That's leadership. You're asked a question, you say, well, there's a bunch of other people wrote an editorial, and so, what they said, sort of. But I'm not saying that, but that's what they said. Who the heck cares? And this is about these 2,000 former DOJ officials signing their names for calling for Attorney General Barr to resign because of what they call an improper intervention. This is like a deep state cheat sheet. This is everybody you need to know from the deep state. All right, here you go. They're all coming out of the woodwork, being like, "I'm deep state." They can't even explain to you why the Attorney General should resign, other than the fantasy of he is responsible for the decision to drop. No, the reason they dropped the case against General Flynn, which we're still waiting to see what Judge Sullivan does with that, from what I understand. I'll update that as we finally get a final. Producer Mark, would you just do me a favor and check, make sure I'm not behind the times on that one? I don't think Judge Sullivan has officially said the case is dismissed. I don't know what he could do when the deal. If no one's going to prosecute it, you'd think that, but he might make a lot of noise about it. He might complain and show us that if only the DOJ had been a little bit less corrupt when it was prosecuting Flynn, he would have allowed this thing to go forward. But even Judge Sullivan might have his limits. But Biden, this is the perfect encapsulation of Joe Biden's leadership, or lack thereof. He's asked a direct question. He doesn't answer. He says, "Yeah, what that editorial with the smart guys who do the homework, what they said, did that thing." That's great. Remember, folks, the libs want you to believe that we'd all be safe and things would be better if only this old man, who doesn't know where he is half the time, were in charge.
I mean, literally, President Trump today came out to talk about how the United States is ready to reopen, and they can't even keep the pandemic out of the White House, literally. 2 officials tested positive there. 3 top health officials are self-isolating. Doctors Fauci, Redfield, and Hahn of the CDC, FDA, and Dr. Fauci, of course, you know. And, I mean, it's not funny. It's dark. But, I mean, it's almost as if sometimes the president doesn't understand that we can see and hear what's going on.
That's some really bad analysis from Fake Tapper, which is not surprising. Of course, the virus is still a threat all over the place. Of course, the virus can still infect people, including at the White House. The issue is how we reopen and how we start rolling back the power that state governments in particular have taken into their hands. To that end, I wanted to bring in our friend Robby Soave. He is an editor and writer at Reason.com. He is one of those libertarians that we like, that I tell you about sometimes when I refer to libertarians that we still like. That's Robby Soave. Robby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, man. I thought this country loved freedom. I thought that America was all about individual rights and constitutionalism and don't tread on me and give me liberty or give me death. But apparently it's give me liberty or give me death unless there's a virus that kills less than 1% of the people out there, in which case I will stay home, locked away, as long as you tell me to, without any constitutional authority or even state legislation that says so. What say you, sir? What happened to us?
Yeah, I think it's a shame that big crises often drive people reflexively into the arms of big government or to be demanding large, heavy-handed authoritarian solutions, when often crises like this actually should be showing to us or providing us additional evidence of why we don't easily surrender our freedoms and why we shouldn't and don't wisely come to rely on big government. I mean, for me, and I think for a lot of people, right, this has crystallized a lot of the problems with, I mean, part of their failure has been the CDC screwing up testing from the beginning, learning all that we didn't know. I mean, the government underplayed the threat, then it overplays the threat, then it underplays it again. You should be very wary of having a uniform, centralized kind of control response to something like this, because they do so often get it wrong. And I'm talking in a philosophical sense, not even in a sort of narrow political sense, having to do with this administration or any other. But and so many rules that we put in place in a kind of knee-jerk way in response to crises, they look short-sighted and wrong sometime later, and they often stay with us. We don't get rid of them. I think of the TSA and Patriot Act and all sorts of other things we responded to in our last series. Right.
The TSA is going to look lean and mean compared and effective compared to the army of 100,000 disease tracers that we're supposed to set up now, according to the experts who, as you said, look, it's not a partisan thing to say that government at all levels, on both sides of the aisle, and including the permanent government of the bureaucracy, and you mentioned the CDC, they've been wrong a lot on this. Now, they had imperfect information to begin with, and, it's easy to play the hindsight game, but it is a fact that they've been wrong at key junctures over the last 5 months or so, and yet we keep hearing the same appeal to authority of just, shut up, peasant, listen to them, you're not an expert. And I'm like, I'm going to listen to Governor Cuomo? This guy's a buffoon. This guy, for example, in New York, where the state that I'm in, I know you're down in D.C., he's presided over the biggest COVID-19 disaster in the world, and the media has somehow turned him into a hero. How is that possible? Well, what are the results that he's pointing to that we're supposed to think are so good?
Yeah, turning political figures into heroes. The issue is that political figures have an incentive to look strong and tough, like they're doing something, even if what they're doing is not smart or may even be contrary to what the people want, and actually might be contrary to what public officials say. I mean, there has been this effort to close beaches, for instance, in California, public spaces, that actually, to my mind, runs quite contrary to what we're learning and public health officials are telling us about where this disease is likely to spread. I mean, if you want people to do aggressive social distancing for the for the just total, like forever, for the months and perhaps years until we're going to get a vaccine is what it sounds like at some point, which I think is crazy. But one thing you're going to have to do then is let people into public spaces where it might be less risky to congregate. And everything we're learning tells us that beaches, parks might be places like that. But of course, the government officials are saying, nope, lock them down. We're being strong. And if you're violating what we're telling you, we're going to throw you in jail. Tom Wolf, the governor of Pennsylvania, said something to that effect yesterday. It's just, we have to be doing something, and this is something, so we're going to do it. That's like how political leaders operate, right? It's not measured, it's not calm, it's not even responsive to what public health officials want a lot of the time.
And I do think that, I don't know if there's a little bit of an I told you so vibe coming from some libertarians like yourself or not, but on the right, where I clearly reside ideologically, we have a general appreciation for, some would even say that go as far as to say reverence for, having actually worked in law enforcement. I see the good and the bad in these things. But overall, we're very supportive of law enforcement. I feel like some of the libertarians out there might be pointing to the excesses of arresting a parent in front of their kids for being in a playground because of some governor's, diktat. And you guys look at this and say, told you that they will. Not all cops and not all state troopers, but some of them, when they're told to do things that they clearly shouldn't do, they'll do them.
Yeah. I think it's a lot of people on the right are seeing that this is what it looks like, law enforcement in practice. I know there are a lot of conservatives who want to exercise their constitutional rights too, without being hassled by the police state. And I just think this is so counterproductive, by the way, to have like these kinds of police encounters where you're probably that involve heavy contact, by the way. Isn't the thing we're trying to prevent is like physical contact? It's good that people are broadly I think people are broadly following the social distancing guidelines. I think it's fair to question how much longer we can follow the most aggressive form of that. But people have voluntarily complied even before the government started ordering them to shut down. So then it becomes, if most people are going along with doing the right thing generally, why should we have the government step in those couple exceptional cases and use like aggressive force to try to resolve those things? I think that just creates more problems than it solves, to my mind. And that would be like sort of the libertarian reflection on that. If people are mostly listening to what they're supposed to do on their own without being forced, do we really need to stick guns in their faces? I don't think so.
And libertarian Robby Soave, I've got to wonder how you and your folks, from your perspective, view the possibility that some are raising of vaccination certificates, ankle monitoring bracelets for people that are on quarantine, app downloading to put your symptoms into so that the test and tracers can find you as quickly as possible. That to me sounds, if we were trying to create the turnkey ultimate surveillance state, we would have put in place, if we do these things, pretty much everything we need to do. And this is, for example, what South Korea is doing. I mean, all those steps have been taken by some countries, or at least by one country.
Right. I mean, some of this stuff is concerning, and also some of it is, even if it's not concerning, it's hard to imagine enough of the American public accepting it as would need to happen. I really want to get back to life as close to normal as possible as we can and reopen things. And despite being a libertarian, I might, if we have to make trade-offs between we're going to do this or we're going to, have the armed guards keep everyone in their house for weeks, I might say this is a better option. So I think it's fine to consider these things and have those conversations. But it is true that a lot of it is kind of from the talk of dystopia, and it's just hard for me to imagine it working out in any case.
Oh, now, since I see it behind you, and I feel like somehow must have been skipped by your PR agency. Usually we have people that are sending books. Like, I haven't even heard of these people. They're sending books. They all want to come on the radio show and plug the book. Robby Soave has Panic Attack, his book behind him on the shelf. I don't think I ever got to talk to you about it. I just wondering, what's the book about? And how come we got skipped on the list, Robby?
It's about viruses and pandemics. And no, I'm just kidding. It's about the problem of free speech and due process on college campuses. The threat to actually traditionally liberal principles like free speech and due process from the college activist set, the woke mindset. So I talked to a lot of students and professors who struggled with the mounting hostility to the norms of free expression in American higher education. Actually, the due process stuff is a little bit relevant to what's happened just recently. The Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, last week recommended changes to Title IX, which is the sexual misconduct adjudication, which is something I talk about at great length in my book, that actually had a lot to do with not just harming due process, but also harming free speech on campuses. Betsy DeVos has revised the bad existing guidance from the Obama administration. Of course, Joe Biden swiftly promised to undo that if he becomes president, despite, of course, being in a position where he is actually needs to be insisting upon due process for those accused of long ago sexual misconduct, which I find stunningly hypocritical.
See how we worked in that book plug for Panic Attack by Robby Soave at the end here? Cool, like the other side of the pillow.
I appreciate it.
That's how we do it with the Freedom Hut. Robby, thank you so much for joining, man. Good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.